I'm delighted that you are joining us for tonight's community conversation. As some of you may know, my office has been hosting community conversations for many years now on a range of different topics, and we always appreciate the experts that we get to hear from, and all of your great feedback and questions. And tonight's format, will be the same. After my quick introduction, we've got two amazing panelists who are experts in the Massachusetts state budget, and they'll be sharing with us their thoughts and their expertise around different aspects of the state budget. And then after that, we'll have plenty of time, for your questions for myself and our panelists and your feedback about the state budget. I do want to, before we dive in, I want to thank Paul Albright from my office, who did a lot of hard work to pull together tonight's community conversation. So thank you very much, Paul. All right, let's dive in. As I think you hopefully know, the topic tonight is the $60 billion plus Massachusetts state budget. The state budget is fundamentally a piece of legislation. It is the most important piece of legislation that our state lawmakers and Governor Healy debate and pass every single year, because we do annual budgets. So every single year we have to go through this process again. And this is basically what you see on the screen right now is essentially the steps that we go through, if you will. The process begins actually in December, when we reach agreement between the House, the Senate, and the governor on how much revenue we expect the state to bring in the next fiscal year. Because that's important, because we want to make sure we're all working, building a budget using the same assumption with regards to how much revenue the state will have to spend. The governor then puts forward her proposal in January. Then there are a series of public hearings that take place. Those have just begun right now, actually, where the public and advocates can weigh in on the budget. And those take place at the State House and in other parts of the state as well. Then the House of Representatives in April, they put together their proposed budget, and they debate it and pass it in late April. The same process then repeats itself in the state Senate in May. And then after the House and Senate pass their budgets, there's typically a lot of similarities and overlap, but there are also differences. And those differences have to be reconciled. And that is done in what's known as a conference committee, where 3 representatives and 3 senators represent the branches, and they work closely together for several weeks, typically, can sometimes take more than a month, to put together a final budget that the legislature as a whole signs off on, and then sends that to Governor Healy for her review and her signature. She can also send back some amendments or vetoes to the legislature, but essentially she signs the budget. So the fiscal year starts July 1st. So this whole process leads up to July 1st of the year. And this coming July 1st will be the beginning of fiscal year 2027. So that gives you an overview of the budget. I guess the other thing I'd say is that $60 billion plus gets allocated across literally hundreds of different programs and accounts. You'll learn more about that tonight. But just so you can start putting it in perspective, the 2 largest parts of the budget by far are the state's Medicaid program, which is known as Mass Health. And then the second largest part of the budget is our school funding, which is known as the Chapter 70 program. So those are both many billions of dollars. And they're the 2 largest accounts that we fund. But then again, there's, as I said, hundreds and hundreds of other programs that you learn more about tonight. And each of those, the legislature and the governor need to come to agreement on exactly how much funding will be provided, what additional policy requirements will go along with that funding. Oftentimes there's strings attached, there's specific spending requirements, there's reporting requirements that have to be made by the departments that are spending that money. And then also the budget often includes what are known as outside sections, which are actually policies that are included as well, because the budget being just a piece of legislation like anything else, the lawmakers can include various different policy proposals in the budget as well. So it typically has a lot in it every year. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first panelist for this evening. That is Chris Marino, and we're just thrilled to have Chris joining us. Thank you, Chris. Chris serves as the Assistant Secretary for Budget at the Executive Office for Administration and Finance. So that's in Governor Healy's team. In this role, he oversees the development of the governor's annual budget recommendation, as well as the management of the Commonwealth's finances over the entire course of the fiscal year. So he has a really big and important job. Prior to his time in this role, Chris spent 9 years with the Massachusetts Senate Committee on Ways and Means, including 6 of those years as the budget director. And in those years, I got to work very closely with Chris. And so I very much enjoyed our time working together. And in fact, as some of you know, as the chair of the Education Committee, I helped steer through the Student Opportunity Act. And Chris was instrumental in the development of that legislation. It required a lot of very detailed technical work, digging into the bowels of the funding formula, and Chris really helped navigate our way through that. So I'm very appreciative to him for many things, including the Student Opportunity Act. Chris is a proud graduate of Boston College, from which he earned a degree in political science in 2014. So Chris, over to you. Thank you again for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you so much, Senator. Really great to be here and appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and members of your community. And thank you for all of your years of service in the Senate. Likewise, it was an incredibly wonderful relationship. Really appreciate the opportunity to work with you on the Student Opportunity Act, the budget, and so many other issues that were important across the state and in your community. So again, my name is Chris Marino. I'm over at the Executive Office of Administration and Finance, and I'm going to focus on kind of 2 main pieces of the budget development cycle. I'll talk a little bit about what the state's role actually is, how it moves through the cycle a little bit, and then I'll talk about what's actually in the budget. As Senator Lewis noted, there are over 700 line items in the budget, 700 programs that speak to each other, but also have their different nuances. And so, as part of the budget development cycle, we have to look at each and every one of those line items, ensure that we are doing due diligence on how the programs are functioning, ensuring the right resources are there to help people, and ultimately make sure that it's a succinct package that really kind of works across the board on all of the issues that we are dealing with as a Commonwealth, and making sure that we're covering our bases there. So if we go to the next slide, we could go actually to 3. So I won't spend too much time here. This really covers what Senator Lewis mentioned before. I think the one thing I would add here is one of the great parts about the budget process is, it happens annually. And so kind of through that, we have a lot of recurring opportunities for folks to get involved in the budget process. Senator Lewis mentioned before, we have our consensus revenue hearing to kick things off. We as a state, we're all about consensus building, right? And we're trying to help the most people, bring in the best experts. And it starts right at the very beginning. We bring in economists from across the Commonwealth to come in and talk about what they're seeing in the economy, what it will mean for our revenue collections, and help us to make the most informed decision possible in our revenue assumption for that year. And as we move through the process, it really is collaboration throughout the whole way. We think about, when the governor's budget's filed, we spend months and months both working with agencies across the executive branch, as well as hearing from stakeholders in every field. And we take that feedback very seriously. We want to understand what the issues are on the ground. We want to understand what the issues are in your communities, so that our budget is reflective of that collective, the collective goals, the challenges, and trying to address those. And that happens throughout the whole budget process. We work very closely with the House and with the Senate as they're developing their budgets. We try to be extremely collaborative, communicative. They're hearing the same challenges that we are and the same requests. And so we try to work together there. And then as Senator Lewis noted, we have a series of hearings throughout the whole budget cycle. And so that's an opportunity for the public to really weigh in, make their voices heard, and make sure, again, that we're understanding what they are seeing and what you all are experiencing on the ground, so we can try to be effective and helpful. Outside the formal budget process, if we move to the next slide, We also have a lot of in-year management. And so, I'll talk a little bit about the different roles that the legislature and the executive branch have here, and this is a little bit more focused on the executive branch. But, while the budget is signed in July, the work really kicks off there. And that was something that for me, coming from the legislature, working the Senate for so long on budgets, and then coming to the executive branch was a big learning curve. We really jump right in the summer and early fall into a spending plan process. And that's where we take the budget that was signed in July and put it into action. We understand what the needs can, are the needs the same? Are there going to be supplemental budget needs? Have programs changed in a way that require us to think a little bit about how those dollars are distributed? And so we look at every single appropriation made in the signed budget and actually basically put, action plans out there and how we're going to spend the dollars, employee counts, personnel counts, how we're going to enact initiatives that the legislature asks us to put in play. So that's a really intense process. It's where we really make sure that we're set for the year. That leads us into October 15th. October 15th is where the Secretary of Administration and Finance is required to certify that our revenue numbers are sufficient to meet the spending needs of the year. I think one important element of state budgeting that's important to note, we're required to have a balanced budget. And so that means that we need to, through different checkpoints in the year, ensure that our resources match our spending needs. And in cases where that's not the case, where we realize that revenues are going to fall short of our spending needs, we might have to make revisions to the budget. And that's something that we look at in the fall, closer to the start of the fiscal year to make sure that we're on good fiscal footing as we move through the whole fiscal year. We, in the fall, again, we jump right from those spending plans in the fiscal year that we're in to using that to develop our next fiscal year budget. So again, the governor's budget is developed between the fall and winter going into the new calendar year before filing in January. And then moving through the rest of the fiscal year, we're doing constant review with our agencies. We do a mid-year review exercise that actually is underway right now with our agencies in the executive branch to, again, understand what the spending trends are looking like, what revenue trends are looking like. And then at the end of the fiscal year, we do the same thing. We'll file what we call supplemental budgets throughout the course of the fiscal year. And those are vehicles where, again, if we realize that a certain program needs more funding in order to serve the people that we anticipate it should, or in some cases, a new need comes up that we did not expect when the budget was signed in the summer, we will file those in supplemental vehicles for the legislature's consideration, and that will ensure that we have the right funding level for each item. And that gets us to the close of the fiscal year. We final what we call the closeout supplemental budget. That's one kind of final fiscal package to make sure all of our bills are paid, and then we're right back at it, focused on the next fiscal year. And so if we move on to the next slide, again, very collaborative process between the legislature and the executive branch. There are, however, a number of places where one side has, specific statutory authority versus another. See, most things are joint, right? We have our consensus revenue hearing that we talked about before. That is something that's agreed upon between the executive branch and the legislature. Any adjustment to our tax revenues is something that we deal with together. So if we're in year and we're meeting with economists and we're reviewing our revenue figures, we will jointly decide if a revision is necessary. That, again, can happen through the consensus revenue process. It doesn't happen every year, but it can happen. The actual creation and enactment of the budget, that's something that goes through a whole multi-month process, as we've reviewed before, where the legislature will react to the governor's budget, make changes, take feedback that they've learned kind of over the course of the process, and then it goes back to the governor for her consideration. Mid-year changes in the revenue forecast. So this is another place where we talk about, I guess I'll talk about these two things together. Mid-year changes to the revenue forecast as well as emergency spending reductions. Those are things that are under the executive branch. And that's a case where, again, we have that October 15 certification from the Secretary of Administration and Finance. If we're determining that revenues are insufficient to meet our benchmarks for the year, we can adjust that forecast. And with that comes a need to ensure with a balanced budget provision that our spending levels are appropriately matched with those revenues. Spending increases, again, that's focused on, again, supplemental budgets. Those are things that we take up through the course of the fiscal year. But those are bills that the governor will propose and the legislature has an opportunity to change, make adjustments to. And so, that is very much a collaborative process. And then folks on the capital side, the capital authorization process is in the court of the legislature. We will file bond bills, and then the legislature has the, kind of final authority there in the authorizations. And then we, as an administration, will develop a capital plan. So just because something is authorized in a capital authorization bill does not mean it necessarily makes it into the capital plan. That is something that's developed based on, available resources, what we're able to bond for. And generally speaking, is something that happens over the course of a similar budget development process on the capital side. And so we can move on to the next section. Now, again, just want to focus a little bit on, what's in the budget. And I'm going to focus on FY27. That is the most, that's the bill that is currently being reviewed by the legislature right now. The governor filed it on January 28th, so it's still relatively fresh. But we are in the process now. We had our first Joint Ways and Means hearing where the administration spoke in front of the legislature to talk about the budget. And now I would say the baton has been passed. The budget for fiscal year 27 development is in the legislature's court. But I want to talk a little bit about what went into our recommendation for the governor's budget. And again, what kind of, more macro, what is in the budget, right? It's over 700 line items, $60+ billion. What's actually in there? I'll focus on a few main themes here. And I know Viviana is going to talk a little bit about the surtax revenue. So I'm not, I'll just say here, surtax has been a real game changer in terms of the investments that we've been able to make in the fiscal year 27 budget. You'll kind of see throughout here the things that we focused on have been made possible by the surtax, things from early education to roads and bridges to affordable higher education, again, all made possible by the surtax revenue. But I'll start first, maintaining strong state and local partnerships. I think local aid is one of the main fixtures of the governor's House 2 recommendation, whether it's Chapter 70 in the Student Opportunity Act's implementation, the final year of implementation, to maintaining commitments on Chapter 90 through our fair share investments. Those are really critical. We understand the importance of our municipal partners and the work that you all are doing in your communities, and we want to make sure that the resources are there to help make that possible. I mentioned early education. We have been focused for a while now on a number of key initiatives in early education and care. I'd say first and foremost, stabilizing the system after COVID was a huge goal of ours, and that came to the form of making what once federally funded Commonwealth Cares for Children C3 grants permanent. We're the first state to do that. We've also talked about expanding access to our subsidized childcare system, which we've been able to do. We support over 65,000 seats across the state, which has been significant efforts to grow those number of slots. And another initiative that we've been focused on is universal pre-K in our gateway cities. So I think making sure that folks in the gateway cities that want access, have that opportunity, and that's something I think we want to build on and keep working on, through the budget making process. Our education system, again, another place where surtax has been critical. Well, there's stabilizing the MBTA, supporting, increased safety in our roads and bridges, and then the regional transit authorities. We've been able to make historic investments across our transportation sector, to help make our community safer, to help make our system more modern, and ensure that, every community, regardless of where you are in Massachusetts, has good transportation assets. Higher education, I mentioned, we really have been focusing on a few different affordability efforts there. I'd say a lot of it's coalesced around free community college, which is something that, the Senate has been a really great partner and leader on in making community college free. And then I was focused on the last couple here. I think our safety net services, right? I think the budget is it's a value statement, right? And I think a lot of the investments that we try to make are supporting folks who are amongst our most vulnerable populations and the most need of those safety net services. So whether it's HHS and providing historic level of fundings for our seniors through home care services, or ensuring that the Department of Developmental Services is able to provide significantly incredible services for their populations that they are serving, whether it's community day and work programs or congregate settings, things like that. This budget tries to really focus on those populations who have the greatest needs. It's in the same vein on housing, right? Housing stabilization has been, a real goal of the administration and our partners in the legislature. And that comes to the form in the budget of things like the Massachusetts Rental Voucher Program. We're supporting over 11,500 affordable vouchers in the budget here. And that really helps folks, stay in the housing and their communities that they want to be in, and are able to do so and go to their jobs and not worry about those rent bills. And so that's something that we've been really focused on, is making sure that we have access to affordable housing across the Commonwealth. And then last, I'll just say here, economic development. I think, you'll hear the governor and the lieutenant governor all the time talk about our focus on economic development, ensuring that we're investing in our businesses here, that we're trying to grow sectors where Massachusetts has been a leader, but also investing more in sectors that we can become leaders, right? And so we think about things, we focus so much on things like climate tech. So new sectors that have high areas of growth that we want Massachusetts to be on the cutting edge. And so those are kind of the main highlights going into the governor's budget. If we go to the next slide, just talk about the bottom line here. And I won't spend too much time, but I think just to kind of put the numbers in context, we break this up into a few different ways, because if you look at the bottom two rows here, the Medical Assistance Trust Fund and surtax, those are really dedicated revenues for very specific spending purposes. So you have that revenue, your revenue number is going to be, you spend against that. So that's why we're focused on the top line, what our line item spending looks like. That is really kind of what we are challenged with every year in terms of balancing the budget. You'll see here, we really tried to focus on, maintaining key services, but also curtailing budget growth. And that's really in an effort to live within our means. I think one of the biggest challenges you see is that the cost of doing business in government, whether state government or local government, is going up significantly. Revenues, while growing, not growing at the same pace. And so this year, for example, our consensus revenue agreement assumes 2.4% growth. If we look at the budget and kind of roll up how the budget wants to grow, the budget wants to grow by double digits. We really had to work hard here to both maintain services, but also keep the budget within 1.1% growth compared to our current fiscal year estimates, and 3.5% growth against the GAA. This also keeps us, if we look against our estimated spending number, below the rate of inflation, which is another factor that we try to keep in mind to make sure that we're living within our means. But as we think across the budget, we'll get into in a second to kind of the main, where the money goes. But we think about where the highest cost of growth is happening for everyone, individuals, municipalities, and the state. It's healthcare. We're seeing our Medicaid program is growing dramatically. It's state employee health insurance. Our the group insurance commission that we use for our employee health insurance is going up significantly. We think about the importance of the Student Opportunity Act and implementing that landmark education reform, financial reform. And then all of our safety net programs. These are the places that the budget wants to grow the most, that serve really important priorities of all of ours. And so we really had to balance here, kind of maintaining growth at a reasonable level while also ensuring that those priorities are maintained. And so if we go to the next slide, this is where this is really where the dollars go, right? So this very much simplifies it. And as I mentioned before, there's over 700 line items in the budget. So we really tried to kind of make this a little bit more digestible. But I'll start on the left side here on the revenues. So the primary resource that we rely on for the budget is taxes, right? And so that's where that consensus revenue agreement is so critical to the development cycle, because we want to start from the same, foundation in what we're budgeting against, and taxes is that biggest piece. I will note here, and you'll see in the bottom, right off the top, we have about $8 billion worth of tax revenues that are transferred right away to pre-existing commitments. That's our pension fund. That's our certain sales tax dollars go to the MBTA, the school building authority. So we have certain statutory requirements on kind of where these dollars go. And so just to show, I think the pie is a little bit smaller than it might first appear as we think about the actual budget development cycle. But outside of that, again, I know Viviana's going to talk a little bit more about the impact of federal changes, but federal revenue is another major piece of our resource side of the budget. Most notably, the vast majority of this is in the form of Medicaid reimbursement. So states typically receive, about 50% reimbursement on services provided through their Medicaid program. And so Mass Health, the single biggest, spending area in our budget, we do get support from the feds. And so again, that's very critical to us as we think about, what resources we have to balance the budget and move things forward. And then we also have department and lottery and other transfers. These are really kind of what we, on the non-tax side, what we are collecting through things like, fees, licenses, things like that are just departmental revenues. They're just kind of normal state of fare that we're always collecting. On the spending side, again, we talked about Mass Health. Mass Health is a $22.5 billion program gross. That's $9.3 billion net after you account for federal share. After that, the other largest growing parts of the budget. We have other HHS. So again, you think about services offered for mental health. I talked about the Department of Developmental Services. We have the Department of Public Health. There are a number of key services that are offered, again, for some of our more vulnerable residents that we're supporting through HHS. And so again, that safety net system is a major part of the budget. And again, one of the major cost drivers as we think about, rates going up for human service providers and things like that. We also have our education system. I say, well, Mass Health is the largest kind of department spending. The largest single line item in the budget is Chapter 70, and that's direct school aid to our communities. We also have in there, we have unrestricted general government aid, another major area, debt service that comes in at about $2.7 billion. What I would note here is if you roll up debt service, local aid, Chapter 70, other education, HHS, that's about 80% of the budget. I think if you actually look at the budget and kind of roll everything up and you kind of say, what is discretionary, what is non-discretionary? The vast, vast majority of what's in the budget is non-discretionary. We were actually looking at this not that long ago, and I think you can say that, less than 1% of the budget is truly discretionary as you think about the services that folks are relying on, which means that every single year as we're going through the budget development cycle, we have to make some challenging decisions. And so, again, we really try to balance here living within our means, but also protecting our core services, particularly for those that need it most. And as you kind of look here and see what are the main spending areas in the budget, what's driving the spending, I think you can understand pretty quickly the types of services we're talking about. And so, again, I think this side by side is hopefully a helpful view here. It really tries to break it down in a way to help kind of understand, where are those core services, where are the dollars going. And I think you can kind of break them up into some pretty broad, digestible buckets here that, again, really kind of, I think, demonstrate the importance of the budget and the investments that we're making to help support, individuals and communities. And then I want to finish here, if we go to the next slide, the importance of local aid, right? And local aid comes in many different forms, but I think, the budget this year really tried to focus on ensuring that, we're making good on our promises especially on the education side, and that we are addressing the fact that, municipalities are feeling a lot of the same cost pressures that we are as a state. So again, talked about this before, we are fully funding the final year of the Student Opportunity Act. That comes through in our Chapter 70 investment, $7.6 billion for Chapter 70. And then over $800 million for the special education circuit breaker. I'd say if you look from fiscal year 25 to fiscal year 27's recommendation, I mean, those are both cases where we're seeing significant dollars invested in communities to ensure adequate education for our students. Although we mentioned this before, we have 2.5% growth, which is slightly over the rate of revenue growth, which has been a typical benchmark that the budgets have tried to use in growing our general government aid. We've also talked a lot about the importance of school transportation reimbursements. I think one of the most common requests that we have received over the last couple of years is those reimbursement accounts for school transportation costs, given just the extraordinary cost growth that municipalities are dealing with there. Getting a little bit more in the weeds, some of the smaller programs that we focus on, rural school aid. I think we certainly acknowledge that every school district is facing challenges with cost growth. I think we also understand that in rural districts where enrollment has been going down for a while now, they are experiencing extreme pressures on their school budgets. And so we are making an historic investment. We are recommending an historic investment of $20 million in rural school aid, which would be an increase of $8 million over fiscal year 26. And then I'll stop, again, a program that a lot of folks I'm sure are familiar with, the Payments in lieu of taxes pilot. This is a really popular program going back to municipalities. Our budget recommendation holds all communities harmless to their prior year aid that they receive from the state. Again, I think in recognition that we know all communities are feeling pressures in their budgets, and we want to make sure that folks are at least getting what they got the prior year. But I'll stop there. And again, thank you so much for having me in this opportunity to speak.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. You've given us a tremendous amount to stew on there, and the budget, as you can see, there's a lot to it. It's very complicated, but hopefully after Chris's presentation, you have a better sense at least of how the budget's put together, what the process is, and what some of the major components of the budget include. And Chris really highlighted that it's a collaborative process. not just between the governor's team and the House and the Senate, but also all of the stakeholders across Massachusetts in all the different areas. And that includes, just regular residents of our communities. I value a lot when I hear from my constituents about budget issues that they care about, and I certainly factor that in, when I'm setting my priorities for the Senate debate on the budget. So thank you so much, Chris. Stick around because I'm sure there'll be questions for you. So just as a reminder, start thinking about the questions that you have for Chris, for our next panelist, who I'll introduce in a moment, or for me regarding anything related to the state budget. You're going to be typing those questions right in the chat, and you can start doing that if you want to. And then Paul's going to display the questions right on the screen so everybody can see them, and then we'll be able to answer them. Okay, so we look forward to your questions. But first, I'm really delighted to welcome and introduce our next panelist, who is Dr. Viviana Abreu-Hernández, who serves as the president of the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center. Some of you may know it more colloquially as MassBudget. And MassBudget is a leading voice in our state for economic and social justice, and really recognized nationally for the work that they do. In her leadership role, Dr. Abreu-Hernández oversees the development of research, analysis, and advocacy to advance policy solutions that promote racial and economic justice. And I can personally attest to the very critical work that MassBudget does. I have used their research in many of the policy issues I've worked on. I've partnered with them on policy issues. A great one example is the Fair Share Amendment, or also known as the Millionaire's Tax, or surtax, and you're going to hear a lot more about that in just a moment. Before MassBudget, she served as Vice President of External Affairs at Quinsigamon Community College in Worcester, as the Director of Research and Program Development for SEIU 1199, the Training and Upgrading Fund, that was in New York City, the largest healthcare workforce development organization in the United States, and also as Puerto Rico's Commissioner of Higher Education, where she developed and implemented the first comprehensive higher education public policy for Puerto Rico. So an incredible wealth of experiences in many areas and in many parts of the country as well. She holds a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Puerto Rico and a master's and PhD degrees in political science from Purdue University. So Viviana, it's really such a privilege to have you with us tonight, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Senator Lewis. It is a pleasure being tonight with you and with Chris. And I wanna just acknowledge that Chris and ANF are partners with MassBudget, because we are constantly discussing about how the state can better invest its funds and support the most vulnerable population. So thank you so much for inviting me tonight. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the budget and the highlights of what we see so far. But before just getting into this, I just want to simplify the process that Chris discussed that sounds complicated. But if you think about when you sit with your family at the table or by yourself and you are projecting how much money you're going to bring home that year, from your income or from an additional side gig that you have, or from a possible inheritance that you're getting, or a projected salary increase. So what you do at home at your kitchen table in identifying the revenue you're going to bring in, the money you're going to have in the bank, then you also do an analysis about how you are going to spend that money. So in MassBudget, and Chris and Senator Lewis agree that the budget is a model document. The way that we spend the money tells what our priorities are. So when I give these kinds of presentation, I always say, well, let's imagine that in your home you have after you have paid all of your bills, you have $6,000 left that is unallocated. And then you go into discussing how it is that you're going to use that money. Are you going to go for vacations to Orlando Disney World? Are you going to put that money into a savings account for your kids' college? Or are you going to remodel the kitchen? So each one of those decisions explains what are your priorities in your home and your set of values. So Chris and the senator cannot stress enough how much they deal with competing priorities and different groups throughout the state of Massachusetts that advocate for their own personal interests. So we have amazing coalitions that are constantly asking the state house, the Senate, the House, and also the governor for additional support for quality in education and affordable education and childcare. And at the same time, they are also listening from individuals and corporations that want to cap the contributions that they make to the state spending in terms of taxes. So, so in these competing priorities kind of scenario that the senator, the governor, the House is constantly navigating, they make these kind of moral judgments in terms of how the money is allocated. So now in my first slide, just as a recap of what Chris was talking about, we are looking right now at a proposed budget from the governor of $62.8 billion. Now, it is very important that we underscore and stress that Massachusetts cannot be looking at its budget in a vacuum. That is, Massachusetts is one of 50 states. And there is a partnership between the state of Massachusetts and the federal government. And in the way that, corporations and individuals from Massachusetts pay federal taxes, and the federal government contributes with revenue to the state of Massachusetts budget. So what happens at the federal level has a direct and significant impact on the budget in Massachusetts. So the proposed budget from the governor, and remember that now this is going into the House of Representatives for debates, and there are going to be competing priorities there. So what the governor proposed is not necessarily what the House is going to pass in terms of a budget recommendation. So of the $62.8 billion, 15.8, 15.9, about 25% of Massachusetts revenue comes from the federal government. So keep that in mind, because we're going to be discussing a little bit more what does that mean. 42.2 comes from state taxes that it is not the fair share. And the fair share, which is the surtax, is projected to bring $2.7 billion, and that's what is budgeted. So the fair share was voted by Massachusetts electorate, in which they increase the income tax of those households that have an income of more than $1 million a year. So in Massachusetts, by constitution, the income tax is 5%. And the fair share tax an additional 4% in the second $1 million that incomes of millionaire households were bringing into Massachusetts into the taxes. And the voters specifically said that they wanted all of this money to go into education and transportation. In addition to this $62.8 billion in the recommended budget of the governor, she's also proposing a supplemental budget of $1.2 billion of the fair share revenue that was not budgeted. So in the estimate of revenue of the fair share for 2026, the revenue exceeded that estimated revenue by 1.35 billion, and that money is going to go to capital investment and one-shot deal kind of programs, both in transportation and in education. The next slide. So compared to 2026, the budget proposal is about 3.8 higher than the budget passed by the House and the Senate and signed by the governor in 2026. And that is not adjusted for inflation. So adjusted for inflation is about 1.5% higher. So it is pretty much the same budget as the last fiscal year. Now, in terms of the fair share, the proposed budget is 2.5% higher than in 2026 because Chris's office and the Office of Revenue, the Department of Revenue, are getting better and better every year in estimating how much money the fair share is going to bring. So this, between 2026, the supplemental budget, and fiscal year 2027 budget, we are going to see an investment of the state of Massachusetts of $4.05 billion in education and transportation. The next slide. So, so this is just a breakdown of how much is going to be in the budget is the 2.675 and the supplemental budget is 1.35. So the fair share is invested in education programs. For example, early childhood and education in childcare, higher education affordability. That's when we are seeing the free community college, but also Mass Grant Plus, and additional financial support for students attending four-year institutions, the state institutions, is making higher education more affordable. There is investment also in English as a second language programs. And I underscore this specific program because some of the budget cuts that have happened at the federal level are affecting English language learners. The Student Opportunity Act this year is also going to be fully funded with the fair share. The state financial aid for college education, also very important. And the governor has allocated $200 million to the Discovery, Research, and Innovation for a Vibrant Economy, the DRIVE initiative. And this is specifically to stimulate research and innovation in public universities. And we continue to pay all of the school meals for every child in public schools independently of their household incomes. Then we're going to see that the fair share is investing also in transportation, the workforce development pipeline, and this is including civil engineers that can continue to work in our transportation system, several hundreds of millions of dollars into infrastructure and innovation, the free public buses in all of the regional transit authorities, so our lowest income population do not have to pay the bus fare to be able to go to school, to attend their health care appointments, to bring their kids to school, to attend the parents-teacher conference, and just to show up to work. There is also funding in the repair and maintenance and improvements of roads, specifically in rural areas, tax credits to encourage lower carbon and more sustainable aviation fuel, the micro transit It's also a very good investment because this is public transportation for smaller on-demand routes for passengers where they are not existing bus routes in rural areas, and also investment and tax cuts for startups and other ventures pursuing commercialization and transportation-related technologies and other innovations. Now, what are our concerns? And this is what I wanted to bring back to you and to my first point about Massachusetts budget not being discussed in a vacuum. So the federal administration, when they passed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, also known as the OB3, that bill gives about $1 trillion in tax cuts to the wealthiest corporations and individuals in the country. So contrary to Massachusetts, that it has to pass a balanced budget, the federal government doesn't. They can actually increase the debt ceiling and continue to make investments and pay the bill a little bit later. Now, what is happening at the federal government is that those tax cuts given to the wealthiest individuals means that the wealthiest individuals are not going to contribute to the federal government with taxes. And the way that the federal government is managing that lack of revenue is by cutting human service programs. So the same amount, which is the $1 trillion that is being provided in tax cuts to the wealthiest, is going to be cut in programs such as Medicare, Medicaid, in Pell Grant. There is a cap for availability of student loans for for students attending higher education and graduate programs. There are cuts in SNAP benefits. There are cuts also in WIC benefits, the Women, Infant, and Children Food Sustainability Programs, Head Start, and all of those programs that are being cut affect the most vulnerable populations across the country. So one thing that it is concerning about Massachusetts and in other states is that those tax cuts that were given by the federal government to the wealthiest individuals and corporations are automatically adopted by Massachusetts as a state in tax codes. So those tax cuts that were given in the federal government are also being given at the state level. So to be able to prevent that revenue to not leave Massachusetts, there has to be a proactive action of the legislature and the government and the governor by decoupling or opting out of those changes in the federal tax code that have been imported, adopted, and embraced in Massachusetts. So the impact of the Big Beautiful Bill Act tax cuts in Massachusetts in 2026 alone is going to be $636 million that Massachusetts will not receive in income taxes. Now, there is legislation presented by the governor that is being discussed in the State House right now to decouple and postpone the impact of those taxes or the adoption of those taxes in Massachusetts. So the Big Beautiful Bill is giving the tax cuts to the business, cutting Medicaid, SNAP, WIC, Head Start, Pell Grant, student loans, defunding diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it is also significantly affecting Massachusetts revenue. with over $1.1 billion of lost revenue until 2034. So we don't see significant lines of revenue, new revenue lines in the proposed budget by the governor. And there are a couple of proposals that organizations, unions, collaboratives, grassroots organizations are pushing. So the first one is to decouple from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, so Massachusetts can retain the revenue from those, wealthiest businesses and richest businesses. And the global intangible low tax income. That is another proposal that a lot of groups are pushing forward, specifically because these will address corporations that are using tax havens to avoid paying taxes at the federal level and at the state level. So multinational global corporations create subsidiary corporations in tax havens and avoid paying the taxes that of the revenue and the profits that they generate in this specific state. So in the case of Massachusetts, we could be generating significant more money if we will actually increase the percentage of the taxes that these corporations are paying in Massachusetts. There is another concern that we have, which is that there is a ballot question that has gathered the necessary signatures to be in the November elections ballot that will cut the state income tax from 5% to 4%, and that will reduce about $5 billion in Massachusetts budget. So when we think about Massachusetts and in the context of the federal government, we are dealing with a federal administration that has clear values, and they have been shown and demonstrated in the bill that they passed in terms of the budget. So what they are currently doing is pretty much the opposite of Robin Hood. They are taking from the poor by reducing, by increasing eligibility criteria, reducing benefits, and cutting the budget for all of these safety nets programs that help the most vulnerable populations, including our lowest income people in Massachusetts and in the rest of the United States. So by increasing progressive revenue, Massachusetts would be working opposite to what the federal government is doing, which is trying to capture the revenue from the highest and wealthiest corporations to be able to support our poorest communities. So the next slide is just to give you an idea. When we cut the supplemental nutrition, when we cut SNAP, 1 in 6 residents in Massachusetts rely on SNAP for food. 115 million children receive low-income children receive food. 115 million school meals for low-income children at risk. 28% of the residents in Massachusetts are enrolled in Mass Health. So that's about 200,000 residents will lose health insurance by 2034. 140,000 receive assistance programs to pay rent, and 11,000 children attend preschool in Head Start. So the impact of the federal budget cuts, it is really, really significant for the poorest populations in Massachusetts. So I think that's my presentation.
Thank you so much, Viviana. So just so sobering and distressing, where you ended your presentation, right, with just bringing home, what these federal budget changes mean for Massachusetts. And we are in the state legislature, and I know Governor Healy and her team are very worried about what these changes portend. We are talking about what potentially we can do at the state level to mitigate or maybe partially offset. In fact, we've already taken some steps to do that with health insurance. But, the amounts of changes and the size of these cuts are so great that, there's unlikely to be state and local resources to make it up. And that's just not the way our system of government is supposed to work. The federal government has far greater resources than states do, and certainly than cities and towns do. So it's just so upsetting. But we will keep on going. So now it's time for questions. So we're going to bring Chris back in as well. And again, as a reminder, anything that you want to know more about, anything that you've, always wanted to know about the state budget, this is your time to ask us. So just go ahead and type questions right, into the chat, and Paul will display them on the screen, and we'll do our best to answer them. And just as a reminder, I know there was a lot of content in the presentations tonight. You may not have been able to, read it all, but there will be a recording available after this event, so you can always go back and, look more closely at any of the particular slides, or listen again to the presenters if there was something you didn't quite catch the first time. All right, Paul, do we have, let's see, the first question here. From Jason Chen about the Trump administration punishing us for being a blue state and resisting Trump's policies. What scenarios are you planning for further cuts in federal? Okay, so kind of picking up on, thank you, Jason, on what we were just talking about, right? Which is these cuts already, and what about potentially further cuts down the road, and what can what can we do as a state to mitigate them, to prepare ourselves? So. Chris or Viviana, either of you want to start with answering that?
Sure, I can jump in here. We as an administration, when all of these, harmful pieces of legislation were moving, even just that first freeze in all federal funds, right? We moved pretty quickly there to establish a team within the administration to review the federal policies, make sure we're keeping a daily pulse on what those changes look like. Now, right, at a certain point, there are policy changes that are made at the federal level that kind of become the law of the land. And so we need to track that, make sure that we're prepared for when those things are happening. What can we do as a state to pivot quickly? I think one of the biggest things that we can do is just make sure that we are maintaining really strong fiscal policies ourselves to ensure that we are well positioned for any sort of economic scenario that might happen, to preserve key services, to balance the budget, and to make sure that we are staying a step ahead here. So if those types of federal resources are lost, or certain program needs are changed dramatically at the federal level, we're able to understand what the issue is and pivot quickly to help folks and make sure that we are stepping as a state where we can. Now, I'd say the challenge at the same time, right, is, as we talked about, $15 billion in federal resources is a really challenging thing, that if the feds make dramatic changes, we just can't backstop all of that. And so I think we're trying to be really thoughtful here and think through kind of what are the challenges that are in front of us, and how can we thoughtfully and sustainably keep Massachusetts protected as best as we can.
Great. And Viviana, I'm sure you could also speak to some of the ways we could maybe raise some additional revenue, that we've been working on together, like the guilty, so-called guilty legislation. So maybe you could address that.
Yes. So a couple of things. So what I have seen in Chris, this is not something. So before the OBBBA was passed, ANF had a clear idea that the budget cuts were coming. So in the previous budget, the House and the Senate allocated $800 million separated as a cushion. Is that correct, isn't it, Chris, for the last 2026 fiscal year? So about 800 million, and then the governor allocated like another 100 million. So there is a real concern of the administration about having some revenue not allocated to have a caution and see where is that the money we're going to, how are we going to address those? So a couple of things that I have seen in this budget. So a lot of the money that Massachusetts has lost already is in research. Remember that a lot of the grants from NSF and from other federal research organizations that were done in universities and colleges in Massachusetts, that money has gone away. So this DRIVE initiative of $200 million that the governor has put in is a way of making sure that Massachusetts continue to do research and innovation in the colleges and universities. So you can see this kind of allocation. So if you think about Head Start, there is more money that is being allocated into childcare services and childcare centers and the vouchers. If you think about all of the funding cuts that have been done in diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, you can see that there is money going into learning English as a second language. So you can see, but I also have to say that all of these investments are through the fair share. And the fair share has limits. So it's not a limitless funding that we're going to get from there. So I want to acknowledge the voters that were able to see and project the extraordinary need in education and transportation that the state was going to. If this was like really psychic kind of behavior, otherwise Chris would not have had the resources that he has to be able to address college affordability at the community college. And when we think about college, is not only community college and higher education affordability, it's workforce development. Because the more people we put into school with less debt, the faster we're going to get them into the workforce, and the better resources and human capital we are going to have to be able to work in the industries that need highly skilled workers. So I just wanted to address that because I want to acknowledge that there has been extraordinary investment, and that I know that ANF and the House and the Senate is doing this kind of work. Now, are there additional possibilities of revenue? Of course. So it puzzles me why Massachusetts is not fully decoupling of the OBBBA tax breaks to the wealthiest corporations when the whole Massachusetts Congress delegation voted against it. Mm-hmm. So the Massachusetts delegation made a block statement of saying, we don't agree with these tax cuts that are going to be made on the backs of the poorest people in the country. So if we do not fully decouple, we are really importing the OBBBA in terms of tax cuts. And that is a statement. So if we decouple, this is hundreds of millions of dollars that Massachusetts is going to be able to preserve. That's number one. And number two is also targeting multi-billion-dollar corporations that are hiding money, avoiding taxes, and making revenue out of the consumers of Massachusetts. So that's another strategy that we have. So those two to start with.
Great. All right. Well, thank you both. And as I said, I'm proud to be the lead Senate sponsor of the bill that would address offshore tax avoidance, which is the so-called GILTI tax. And if we can get that bill passed, that would bring in potentially several $100 million more in revenue to the state, and every bit will help. All right, let's move to our next question from Paul's putting it up on the screen now. As a school committee member, let's see, we're not over the rule. Okay, so yeah, so this obviously is a question about school funding, and this is something, as folks probably know, was kind of the issue why I originally ran for the state legislature, and was very proud to work on and help pass the Student Opportunity Act with Chris's help. We talked about that, and that has definitely made a big impact for certain, especially for certain districts that serve large numbers of low-income students and students, English learners, students of color. But it hasn't solved all education funding challenges by any means. And as the question points out, there are certainly certain districts that are not getting big increases in state aid. Their costs are going up. They may be facing declining enrollment, which also impacts their funding. And so these are real challenges. And I am committed to continuing to work to further reform the school funding formula. We have an effort underway right now that was launched by the legislature last year that is starting to look at this Chapter 70 formula again. We're going to be finishing up implementing the Student Opportunity Act. So this is an opportune time to revisit, the funding. And the goal should be, to ensure that it's adequate and that it's equitable, regardless of the community that you live in, whether it is, a large urban city, or it's a small suburb, or it's a rural community with low enrollment. So we're committed to that. Chris or Viviana, anything else you wanted to add on this question?
I'm good, Chris.
I would just say, to that point, I think we definitely acknowledge that there have been a lot of pressures on municipalities, and in particular with their school budgets. I think that's where a place that both the legislature and the administration is also focused on is the minimum aid the last couple of years. And again, another place where we've been able to use the surtax last year to significantly increase minimum per pupil aid. And again, even in this year's House 2 recommendation, trying to maintain an elevated level of $75 versus the $30. So I think at the very least, as an acknowledgement that we understand that those pressures are still there, and not every district has necessarily seen the same benefit of the Student Opportunity Act. I think that's a place where we have tried to partner together to find ways to help where we can, while also acknowledging that it is a challenge.
Yeah, that's a great point. Sorry, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. No, I just want to mention that Senator Lewis and Chris are very well aware that the funding formula for Chapter 70 has a cap for inflation, and that the inflation has been significantly higher than what the increase in the budget based on projected inflation is, and that that has created school districts have received less money because the inflation glitch has not been fixed. So the Student Opportunity Act that was supposed to be on top of Chapter 70 has not necessarily had the impact that some districts expected, because it has to cover some of the shortage in the budget from Chapter 70. So, but this is something that Senator is very well aware, and this is why they are studying the formula again.
Yeah, no, that's a very important point. We had several years of historically high inflation, and the formula, you're right, didn't fully account for that, and so that is a deficit. But we will. This is definitely something we're well aware of. I hear about this, all the time from my school committee members and superintendents and families, and I hear from my colleagues as well, who represent communities all across the state, about the challenges in funding our schools. And we need to continue to really build on the Student Opportunity Act and do more to help, especially with special education costs, school transportation costs, mental health needs for students, and so forth. All right. Do we have another question, Paul? All right. Let's see. Jason has another question for us. Property value and income, if offered for the cut by, okay. All right, Chris, do you want to take this one? It looks like it's
Mhm.
really about sort of how safe is unrestricted local aid in Chapter 70 when we are facing federal budget cuts and potentially a downturn in the economy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say our house two recommendation is probably the kind of greatest proof is in the pudding, right? I think this was something, we made both investments in UGA and maintained our investment, the path on the Student Opportunity Act in the House 2 recommendation, despite the fact that we have been seeing these significant pressures on the federal side. I mean, I think these are core priorities. Again, our partnership with our municipalities is really critical. We value that. And I think you'll hear, folks in the administration talk about that across the board, that we really value those partnerships and want to prioritize that. And so I would say, our budget recommendation really tries to do that. Again, historic investments in Chapter 70 in special education circuit breaker, maintaining growth slightly above our rate of revenue growth for UGA. I think those are things that we really try to prioritize for fiscal year 27, despite the pressures that we are facing from our federal government.
Yeah, and I can say as from the perspective of the legislature, for me and my colleagues, there's nothing more important than school funding and supporting our communities, because that's a priority for every one of us. So we do everything we can to protect Chapter 70 funding, and in fact, we've grown Chapter 70 funding a lot, obviously, over the last decade or so, and especially since the Student Opportunity Act passed. And one of the things we benefit from with the Student Opportunity Act, as Viviana pointed out, is the fact that the Fair Share Amendment passed. We have that additional revenue for education. So we are able to augment or supplement Chapter 70 using fair share money, like we did last year, where we increased that minimum amount of aid per pupil that Chris was talking about. That's how we were able to do that. So I feel, confident that we will continue to prioritize Chapter 70 and unrestricted local aid. So it looks like Jason's digging in a little bit more. I can quickly take that, Chris. We don't differentiate when we determine local aid and when we calculate Chapter 70. Chapter 70 uses a formula, so a community's ability to contribute to its own schools does factor into that formula. But with local aid, there's no precedent for giving less to a community just because it's higher income community. There is a certain amount of local aid communities have been receiving historically, and we typically grow that, by a certain percentage. There is, I should say, however, there is a conversation that is starting, still preliminary, about whether we should look, the legislature should look differently at how we apportion local aid. Whether there should be an updated formula developed, for determining how we distribute unrestricted local aid. But, that's far, a long way from building any consensus around that, never mind implementing it. And even if that were to come to pass, I am confident we would be holding harmless communities. So it would just, it wouldn't result in actually reduced revenues for communities. It would just be about how the revenue, that the funding is, how it grows in the future. All right, let's see. We have another question here.
Oof.
Okay. Oh. All right. What do you think, Viviana? Big round numbers here, I guess.
Well, Chris can help me here. So, so there are so many budget cuts in different areas of the BBA that we will have to just talk about different areas. So let's think about the revenue that will go in terms of income taxes to the state of Massachusetts. That's the one that I was talking about decoupling. So I think that the Department of Revenue estimated that if we import, embrace, adopt those tax cuts, we're going to be losing about $1.2 billion throughout 2034. So that is in terms of income taxes. If we look into the budget cuts that seem to be materializing in Pell Grant, then, free community college. So when you think about free community college, is the last dollars after every other financial aid possibility is provided to the student. So if you reduce the Pell Grant that the student receives, then the fair share is going to have to put more money into free community college to be able to make up that gap. And that is going to happen with any other financial aid support provided, state financial aid that is on top of the federal financial aid, which is the Pell Grant. If we think about budget cuts in SNAP, well, food is not part of education and transportation, but with the fair share, we are paying the free school meals for children in all of the public school at no cost, independently of the income. So at least you guarantee that your kids for free are going to have 2 good meals completely paid by the state through the fair share. Now, if we think about the budget cuts that are going to come into Medicaid, then fair share can't cover that because fair share only goes for transportation and education. So, Chris, what did I miss?
No, I thought that was great. I think putting a kind of finer tune on some of the numbers that we're tracking. We actually have a website,
Yes.
mass.gov, that tracks all of the federal cuts that have been made and kind of what we're tracking there, both in terms of congressional action, so OB3, and executive branch action by the Trump administration. Right now, we view that about $3.7 billion in impacts on both on budget and off budget cuts that have been made at the federal level impacting Massachusetts. Of that total, about $1.3 billion is what we viewed right now as state budgetary impacts. Again, with the half of that being the corporate tax policies that have been made. So I think everything else totally makes sense. Just putting some numbers on kind of what we're viewing at the macro as the impacts of those policy changes.
The other thing that I don't want us to lose perspective of is the impact of tariffs. So everything is more expensive. So we are not only talking about how much the state can make up for the programs, so that the state funds to make sure that that people can live thriving lives, but the tariffs themselves is another gigantic tax that is being placed on individuals because businesses pass the tariffs to the customers. So there is also that there's not much that Massachusetts can do about that. And that is another federal policy. It's not only the OBBBA, but you also have policies that is the dismantling of the Department of Education at the federal level. And with that, it's going every program about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which supported extraordinary initiatives that have helped students with disabilities, student low income, first generation college students to be able to have the resources to stay in college. Because one thing is just admitting the students into the university. The other thing is to provide the students to be successful at the college level education. So it is so extraordinary that just trying to tackle each one of these portions is really difficult. And it's in every level. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, certainly not an easy question to answer. But bottom line, I guess, is there, as we said previously, there is no way for the state to tap any revenue source to fully make up for these federal cuts. We're going to hope that some of these maybe get reversed or again get mitigated in some way. But it's a very tough situation that we're facing, and other states are facing as well. Paul, do we have time maybe for one more question? Okay, we have a question. Maybe this will be the last one. on the budget and healthcare affordability. So a very obviously a critical issue for families is is access to affordable quality healthcare. And again, we're very concerned about these changes to federal eligibility for Medicaid, which in Massachusetts is the Mass Health Program. So what maybe Chris or Viviana, what do you think are some of the areas we're trying to help people afford their healthcare and maintain access?
Yeah. So I would say, again, one of the top priorities we as a Commonwealth chair is access to healthcare and strong healthcare, right? And I would say under Governor Healy's leadership, we put together a healthcare affordability working group that's actually bringing together, like we talked about collaboration, right? We are bringing together all of the experts in healthcare across the Commonwealth to look at this issue and come up with solutions to help make healthcare more affordable for all of us. And so that's something I think we're really excited about that work going underway. The folks have already started meeting there, breaking up into groups to target certain areas, high cost areas that are really driving some of this. Because again, it's a real challenge. And I think, again, we've talked about the size of the budget that's dedicated to these healthcare costs. So it's at every level, right? Individuals are dealing with high premiums. The state is dealing with the high costs of covering its members, both state employees, but also folks on the Medicaid program. And that seeps in everything else, right? If healthcare is eating up more of the budget, it means we don't have space to pay for other priorities as well. So it really does impact everything. So I say this working group, I think, is a really good step. I think we're really excited about the recommendations that they'll come together and give us so we can, really put it to work and try to focus on bringing those costs down. Oh, sorry.
Yep. Yeah, we heard you. We heard everything you said. Yes.
But yeah, I think that's one way that we're really trying to tackle this, is really leaning on our experts and trying to get the best advice possible on the different routes we can take.
Yeah. And we have, passed some very important legislation in recent years addressing, drug costs for pharmaceuticals, pharmacy benefit managers, trying to rein in those costs, also to expand the workforce, especially in mental health. So that we have more therapists and mental health clinicians. And we are looking hard at primary care right now and what we can do to, make it easier to access primary care for folks. We know that's a very challenging area. So a lot of work to do in healthcare, but certainly the state budget is a big part of that. I think that's probably bringing us to the end of tonight's community conversation. As you can see on the screen, certainly feel free to follow up at any time, with my office. There you can see the phone number, the email. If you want to have further questions on the budget, or you want to provide us feedback as we continue working on the budget for fiscal year 2027. But thank you so much to Chris and Viviana, taking time from your very busy schedules, doing such a great job, helping educate us all on the state budget process and what's included in the budget and some of the highlights and some of the concerns we need to be all aware of. So thank you, folks, for joining us. We really appreciate you tuning in, and thank you for the questions, and wish everybody the best in continuing to dig out from the latest storm and get ready for the next one. And wishing everybody, a very good night. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.